My mother always told me I was born with a gift. As a child, I saw monsters lurking in the shadows whenever the lights went out. I would sprint to my room, heart pounding, terrified they would catch me. Most kids have this fear, I suppose, but I never outgrew it. When I was very young, these monsters were shapeless, shadows that morphed and slithered just beyond the reach of light. I would lay in bed, eyes wide open, blanket pulled up to my chin, ears straining to catch the faintest whisper of movement. My nights were a constant battle between exhaustion and fear, sleep a rare and precious commodity. My mother would come in, sit on the edge of my bed, and tell me soothing stories about brave children and protective spirits. It never worked. The moment she left, the shadows would return, and with them, the monsters. As a teenager, I became the outcast, the one everyone avoided because I was scared of everything. My classmates whispered about me, their words a low hum of derision and curiosity. While others explored abandoned buildings and partied in the woods, I refused. They thought I was a coward. What they never realized was that I saw things they couldn't. Their parties in the woods were to me gatherings of unseen horrors. Their abandoned buildings were haunted in ways they could never comprehend. What I have learned is that the young ones are particularly sensitive to them. Do you ever wonder why children always seem to be afraid of monsters? They see something under their bed and want to sleep in their parents' room. It's because they know what I know, before their parents convince them it's not real and their gift goes away. I bet you have some memories of this too. Maybe you remember a time when you were certain there was something in the closet, or the way the shadows seemed to shift and change when you were alone in your room. Maybe you dismissed it as childish imagination. I couldn't afford that luxury. They don't mind children seeing them. I'm not sure why. It could be that they don't perceive them as a threat because no one will believe them. Parents dismiss the fears, tell their children there are no monsters. It's just the wind. It's just the house settling. They smile and turn off the lights, leaving their children alone in the dark. But the monsters react differently when you get older. As a teenager, I noticed they became somewhat agitated when I made eye contact with them. Now, as a young adult, they get furious if they realize I can see them. My life has become a facade of constantly pretending I don't notice them. When I go to a friend's house for dinner, I have to act like there isn't a young girl hanging by a rope in the living room. Have you ever been reading horror stories or watching a scary movie late at night? Then suddenly you feel like something moves in the shadows at the edge of your periphery? I know you know what I'm talking about. You're more sensitive to them then, but they always escape before you get a good look. Consider yourself lucky. I loved my mother, and I miss her dearly, but she was dead wrong. This is not a gift. It's the furthest thing from it. They surround me every day, everywhere I go. After a while, some friends at school approached me, wanting to know what I saw. They saw it as a thrill. To them, I was a glorified Ouija board. I agreed to come to a sleepover and tell them what I saw. It was a way for me to get back at the monsters haunting every waking moment, a way to expose them. I should have known it was a bad idea. Trust me when I tell you, you do not want to know what's in your house. That night, we gathered in the dimly lit living room of my friend Samantha's house. She turned off all the lights and lit some candles, casting a soft, flickering glow that made the shadows dance and twist in the corners of the room. The group of girls sat around me in a semicircle, their pajamas a mix of bright colors and comforting patterns, a contrast to the dark atmosphere that had settled over us. Each of them clutched their pillows, their eyes wide with anticipation, their breaths shallow and quick. The room was silent except for the occasional creak of the house settling and the steady drip of wax from the candles. It felt like the entire world had shrunk down to the circle of light we were sitting in, the darkness outside our only audience. They asked what I saw, their voices barely above whispers, as if speaking too loudly might summon the very things they were curious about. I saw 3 that night. The first was a tall, gaunt woman, her head nearly touching the ceiling. Her presence was overwhelming, like a dark, looming tree. Her long black hair cascaded down, reaching the floor and almost completely obscuring her body. Her eyes were hollow, empty voids that seemed to swallow the light. As I began to describe her, she turned slowly, deliberately, and walked across the back of the room. Her huge feet thudded on the floor with each step, a sound that echoed in the oppressive silence, sending shivers down our spines. The girls' faces blanched, their eyes darting to the spot where I said she stood. The next was a young boy, crouched underneath the coffee table. He was small, with a face twisted in fear and pain. His clothes were tattered, and his skin was pale, almost translucent. As I spoke of him, his mouth opened in a silent scream, a scream that seemed to vibrate in the very air around us. His eyes were wide, filled with a terror that was all too familiar to me. He stayed there for a moment, his silent scream lingering, before he disappeared into the shadows. The flickering candlelight played tricks on the girls' eyes, making them see the boy where there was nothing but darkness. Finally, there was a man outside the window, his face pressed against the glass. His eyes were dark and piercing, filled with a malevolent intensity. His mouth was twisted into a snarl, revealing teeth that looked sharp and jagged. The more I described him, the angrier his expression became. He didn't just watch us, he stared into us. Slowly, methodically, he began to climb up the side of the house, his movements jerky and unnatural. The sound of his fingers scraping against the window pane was a grating, nails-on-chalkboard noise that made everyone flinch. The room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees, the cold seeping into our bones. My friends' faces reflected a growing horror. Their initial excitement had evaporated, replaced by nervous laughter that was thin and strained. They tried to brush it off, to convince themselves and each other that it was just a game, just a story. But their eyes betrayed them. They didn't understand. They couldn't. The monsters I described were real, and they were angry. The more I revealed, the more restless the creatures became. I could feel their hatred, their desire to remain unseen, to continue their existence in the periphery of human awareness. Samantha's lower lip began to tremble, and tears welled up in her eyes. She started to cry, her voice breaking as she spoke. When I was a little girl, I used to hear a thudding noise around my house. I thought it was just my imagination. But now I think I'm hearing it again. Her words hung in the air, heavy with fear and a chilling confirmation of my worst fears. She was hearing it. I was sure of it. As Samantha's tears flowed, her body shook with quiet sobs. The room was thick with tension, every girl's gaze darting around, trying to spot the unseen threats I described. The flickering candlelight cast shifting shadows that seemed to reach out toward us, amplifying the fear that had taken root in each of us. I reveled in the monsters' anguish. They hated me seeing them. They hated even more that I made others see them. It was a small victory in a war I had been fighting alone for so long. I continued to describe her, feeding off their terror. "She's in the corner now," I said, my voice low and steady, her hair brushing against the floor, her eyes fixed on us. The tall, gaunt woman seemed to react to my words, her movements becoming more pronounced. "She's moving faster now," I added, her strides growing longer, more frantic. Each step she took reverberated through the room, a heavy thud that made the girls grip their pillows tighter, their knuckles turning white with fear. The woman's pace quickened, her massive strides carrying her across the back of the room in seconds. Her feet banged against the walls with each pass, a relentless, haunting rhythm that seemed to echo inside our skulls. I described her in excruciating detail, the way her hair tangled and swayed, the hollow look in her eyes, the musty, decaying smell that followed her. The room felt colder with each word, as if the temperature dropped in response to her growing fury. I knew I should have stopped, but the hatred I held for these creatures drove me on. They had tormented me for years, and now, finally, they were suffering too. The other girls could hear her now, the thudding, the scraping, the low guttural moans that filled the silence between each stride. They were no longer just figments of my imagination. They had become real, tangible horrors to everyone in that room. Then, there was a moment of stillness. The pounding stopped, and the air seemed to freeze. Time itself felt suspended as we strained to hear any sign of the monsters. The silence made every second stretch into an eternity. We sat there, paralyzed, listening, waiting. Suddenly, a loud bang shattered the silence as the front door swung open with a violent crash. Samantha lunged for the light switch. The room was flooded with harsh, artificial light, dispelling the shadows and revealing nothing but a group of crying, terrified teenage girls. "Get out! Get out of my house!" Samantha screamed, her voice hysterical. She pushed me towards the door with surprising strength, her hands trembling. I stumbled outside, turning back just in time to see her slam the door in my face. The sound echoed in the still night, a final punctuation to the terror I had unleashed. I stood there for a moment, the cold air biting at my skin, my heart pounding. I had gone too far, I knew it. But there was a small, dark satisfaction in knowing that someone else had experienced just a fragment of my reality. The feeling was fleeting, quickly replaced by a deep sense of regret and dread. The next Monday at school, Samantha didn't show up. Whispers followed me through the halls, hushed conversations that ceased abruptly whenever I walked by. Faces turned away, eyes averted, as if acknowledging me would make them part of the nightmare. By lunchtime, the gossip had spread like wildfire. I was the girl who saw demons, who had brought them into Samantha's house. The teachers looked at me with a mixture of concern and suspicion, their whispers almost as loud as the students. After lunch, I was called into the school psychologist's office. The room was warm and cluttered, filled with shelves of books and comfortable chairs. The psychologist was a kind-hearted old man, his eyes gentle behind wire-rimmed glasses. Looking back on it as an adult, I realized he could have probably made a fortune in private practice, but he chose to take half the pay to help kids who really needed it. I respected him for that. But respect didn't stop me from lying. He asked me gentle, probing questions, his voice calm and soothing. "I've heard some stories going around," he began, "about you seeing things. Can you tell me about it?" "No," I replied, my voice steady. "I don't see ghosts. I didn't go to a sleepover. I'm not still afraid of the dark." Each lie was smooth, practiced. I had learned long ago how to hide my reality from the world. I knew better than to tell the truth. Telling the truth would mean more questions, more attention, and possibly even more disbelief. The psychologist leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed intently on me. "It's important to be honest about what you're experiencing," he said softly. His voice was calm, measured, but there was an underlying intensity in his gaze. "Sometimes our minds can play tricks on us, especially when we're scared or stressed." I nodded, my expression carefully neutral. "I understand, but there's nothing to worry about. It's just silly rumors." I was proud of how convincing it sounded, even to me. He sighed, a deep, weary sound. He wasn't convinced, but he couldn't push further without more evidence. "All right," he said, his tone casual. "Then, you don't mind if I turn out the lights, do you?" The question hung in the air. He was good. Years of experience had honed his instincts, allowing him to see through the facade I presented. He could tell when children were lying, when they were saying they were okay when they weren't. His eyes bore into mine, challenging, probing. I had a fleeting moment of doubt, but I pushed it aside. I was confident in my ability to handle whatever appeared. After all, I had been dealing with these entities for as long as I could remember. The room was already dimly lit, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows through the blinds. As he flicked the lights off, the room plunged into near darkness, the weak light from outside doing little to dispel the gloom. My heart sank. The woman from the house was there in the corner. She stood still, her tall, gaunt figure blending into the darkness. Her eyes, deep and hollow, made every hair on my body stand straight up. I fought against the rising tide of fear and emotion, struggling to maintain my composure. "See, there's nothing here," I said. "I'm fine." But I wasn't fine. I really, really wasn't. You need to understand that these spirits are always confined to the same place. If I saw something in a basement, it was always in that basement. It was never anywhere else. But this woman, this tree woman, had followed me. The realization was a cold, hard knot of fear in my stomach. Her presence here, in this room, shattered everything I thought I knew about the boundaries of their existence. I could feel her anger. My emotions betrayed me. The psychologist was still watching me, his gaze unwavering. He must have seen the fear in my eyes, the slight tremor in my hands. When he flicked the lights back on, tears were streaming down my face. The dam burst. I didn't just cry, I wailed. The sound was raw, primal, a release of years of pent-up fear and anguish. I collapsed to the floor, my body convulsing with sobs. He came over and tried to console me, his hands gentle on my shoulders, his voice soothing. But I was inconsolable. My life had been spent on the edge of a mental breakdown, and through my own stupid actions, I had pushed myself over the edge. The realization that the monsters could follow me, that they could breach the boundaries, was too much to bear. They took me to inpatient mental health and loaded me up with drugs designed to dull my senses and calm my nerves. The fluorescent overhead lights and smell of disinfectant were both sterile and institutional, but somehow I found a modicum of peace here. Art therapy sessions became a refuge, a way to express the darkness inside me. I poured my fear and anguish into my drawings, the images of the monsters taking form on paper. The act of creation was cathartic, a way to externalize the internal horrors that plagued me. Yoga sessions grounded me to the present, and reading groups helped me express my thoughts. Most importantly, the lights were always somewhat on. Despite the circumstances, I actually made friends with a lot of the other girls. We bonded over our shared experiences, our struggles and fears. In a strange way, these friendships felt more genuine, more solid, than any I had in regular life. We jokingly called the place our grippy sock jail, on account of us all having to wear socks so we didn't strangle ourselves with shoelaces. The name brought a sense of levity, a way to reclaim some control over our environment. We laughed together, shared our hopes and dreams, and for a while the monsters seemed distant, their presence muted by the bonds we formed. I did everything in my power to perpetually convince my doctor that I wasn't ready to return to my life. I fabricated symptoms, exaggerated fears, anything to stay in the protective cocoon of the mental health facility. But after a few months, despite my efforts, they managed to transition me back home. My mother was ecstatic to see me, her eyes brimming with tears of joy. She embraced me tightly, kissing me all over in front of the window, where I could see all my friends watching and laughing. It was a mortifying moment, but the laughter outside wasn't the mean-spirited kind I had been accustomed to. It was genuine, warm, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of normalcy. Back in my room, I kept the lights on 24/7. The brightness was a comforting shield against the encroaching darkness. Per the doctor's orders, we slowly started turning off lights in the house as I felt ready. It was a painstaking process, taking several months for the house to even get dim at night, but the monsters never returned. Each day was a small victory, each night a battle won. Before I knew it, I was sleeping in perfect darkness, a smile on my face. I slept like a baby, the kind of deep, restful sleep I hadn't known in years. It was as if I was catching up on a decade of sleep deprivation, and every morning I woke up feeling a little more like myself. Years later, I got my own place while attending community college. It was a small apartment, but it represented freedom and independence. The memories of my childhood nightmares only came infrequently, like faint echoes of a distant past. Feeling confident and in control, I decided to cut down on my medication, wanting to experience life without the dulling effects of the drugs. Nothing happened for weeks, and I started to believe that the horrors of my past were truly behind me. One night, after brushing my teeth, I flicked off the bathroom light and walked to my room. As I entered and turned off the light, my heart nearly stopped. The tree woman was in the corner, her tall, gaunt figure hunched over, barely fitting under the 8-foot ceiling. Her presence was overwhelming, a dark, suffocating force that made the air thick and heavy. I almost screamed, but instinct kicked in. Somehow I managed to regain control and casually pretended like I didn't see her there. Every muscle in my body was tense, my hands shaking as I moved. She stood still, watching me with those hollow, penetrating eyes. I was shaking, almost violently, and it took every fiber of my being to hide it as I casually crawled into bed. My movements were slow, deliberate, as if any sudden action would trigger an immediate response from her. The sound of her massive feet thudding on the ground as she walked over to my bed echoed in the room. She stood over me, her presence a looming, oppressive shadow. I was drenched in sweat, quivering from fear. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Somehow, I managed to reach into my nightstand, my fingers trembling as I grabbed the bottle of pills. I took triple the dose of my medication, swallowing the pills dry, hoping they would take effect quickly. In a desperate attempt to distract myself, I pulled out my laptop from the nightstand and started browsing Facebook. The bright light from the screen obscured the shadows, creating a barrier between me and the horror standing over my bed. I forced myself to focus on the mundane, scrolling through posts and liking pictures, anything to keep my mind occupied. Minutes turned into hours, and it was past 5 a.m. by the time I closed my laptop. The soft blue glow of early morning filtered into the room, casting gentle rays that illuminated the remnants of night's shadows. With the arrival of dawn, a sense of safety and relief washed over me. The oppressive presence of the tree woman had vanished, retreating into the shadows where she belonged. I let out a shuddering breath, my body finally relaxing as the tension ebbed away. Exhausted, I lay back, my limbs heavy and my mind hazy. Despite the lingering fear, sleep claimed me quickly, pulling me into its embrace. As I drifted off, I knew deep down that I would never truly escape this nightmare. The monsters were a part of me. But for now, I had survived another night, and that small victory was enough. In the days that followed, I clung to my routine. I kept a healthy supply of antipsychotics on standby and took my pills like clockwork. The medication was a fragile barrier between me and the shadows that lurked in the darkness. Missing a dose was not an option. I would sooner die than risk it. Years passed, and I managed to carve out a semblance of normalcy. I found a decent desk job, one that didn't demand too much of me mentally or emotionally. The predictability of office life was a comfort, the monotony a balm for my frayed nerves. I met someone, a kind and patient man who became my boyfriend. He didn't know the full extent of my past, but he accepted me, quirks and all. Together, we built a life that felt safe and stable. Yet the shadows of my past never fully disappeared. They lingered at the edges of my consciousness. Every so often, a stray noise or an unexpected shadow would send me into a full-blown panic attack. Despite the medication and the semblance of a normal life, I remained vigilant, always on guard against the return of the darkness. It was a delicate balance, a precarious dance between sanity and the abyss. I knew better than to let my guard down completely. I'll leave you with this. In the end, the monsters feed on fear and attention. Acknowledging them gives them power, and power is something they must be denied at all costs. So, when you feel a chill in the room, keep your eyes forward and your mind steady. Remember, sometimes the safest path is the one that keeps you blissfully ignorant of the horrors that lie just out of sight. If you find yourself up late one night, and you see something out of the corner of your eye, just laugh it off. Don't turn your gaze to it, and don't go looking for things you'd rather not find. When you feel that chill creep up the back of your neck, whatever you do, do not gaze into the darkness.